Spoiler alert, the John Williams score is not my favorite Superman theme.
I mean, I don't think it's mine either.
Blasphemy!
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I love it, but yeah, I don't think it's my favorite either, but I don't think my favorite theme would exist without it either.
Right, exactly. And it's great. Technically speaking, I would say it's perfect. It's just not the one that hits me in the spot where I love it the most.
God,
but
Case, please stop. They're going to drag us online.
They're going to gush about the John Williams score for quite a bit of time. If anyone thinks that we're not, they're crazy. Everyone, and welcome back to the Men of Steel podcast. I'm Case Aiken, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, J. Mike Folson.
Welcome back, everybody. Today's gonna be fun.
Oh, today's gonna be a lot of fun because we're really gonna get into the rhythm of Superman stuff because today we are talking about themes of Superman. And as you can tell from the voice that just boomed in there, confirming what the Let's Rewatch crew said, by the way, how we approach podcasts, we have our editor. We have Matt Storm with us.
Hey, I'm happy to be here for a galaxy-brained idea of a Superman episode that I yelled at Case about for, I don't know, several years. Almost as much as the animated series episode.
Right, and that made a lot of sense because you had Crash Chords, which was a deep dive music podcast. I listened to a couple of the episodes, even though it had already been on hiatus by the time you and I actually met. And wow, those were deep dives. We're not going to be quite that deep, but we are going to have wonderful people discussing it because also in the room, as you may have heard, we have the friend of all pods, Dan Purcell.
Love that.
What an announcement. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for having me on.
And Dan, I'm so glad to get you on. We've been circling each other on the internet for a while, and it's nice to actually be on a call for you finally.
We have indeed. And it's fitting that we're doing this as I'm sort of gearing up for my own sort of big Superman type reveal of dropping my debut album in a couple months.
Excellent. So at the end of the call, obviously, you should give all the details on where people should be looking for that.
Of course.
But like I said, we're talking about the themes of Superman. And there's a lot. We kind of had to filter out some just because there's no chance that, we're not going to look at every single animated movie that has been released that had some sort of opening credits theme or anything like that. We're trying to get big ticket ones on here, while at the same time not just talking about the John Williams score 5 times. So
I mean, it'd be worth it.
Are we going to do a giant? I have a feeling we're going to do a giant detour about just the music of John Williams in general on this podcast. Because how can we not without having it as hanging over us like a giant S-shaped elephant in the room?
Well, it's so interesting looking at something like this where we're gonna be looking at themes from many, many decades, and one of the nice things about art forms that like this is that it's cumulative. So everything is influenced by the ones that came before or are trying to avoid being too much like the ones before. So no matter what, we're going to talk about how these things play in. So earlier tracks by definition are going to have the disadvantage of not being able to play off the stuff that then comes later. The stuff that comes later can work with, here's the lessons learned and here's how we can build upon it and do it right. But that said, spoiler alert, the John Williams score is not my favorite Superman theme.
I mean,
I don't think it's mine either.
Blasphemy!
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I love it, but yeah, I don't think it's my favorite either, but I don't think my favorite theme would exist without it either.
Right, exactly. And and it's great. Technically speaking, I would say it's perfect. It's just not the one that hits me in the spot where I love it the most.
God, Case, please stop. They're going to drag us online.
We're going to gush about the John Williams score for quite a bit of time. If anyone thinks that we're not, they're crazy. And they know that we're trying to be an optimistic show here. We try not to have bitch sesses. And before we started recording, we were talking about how just listening to all these tracks getting ready for this call, it gets your heart pumping because all of these are bangers in some way, even the worst of them.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, also something important to point out just from my years of experience doing a mediocre music review podcast is that music hits everybody differently, right? I know Dan talks about this on TikTok all the time. Just because something's great doesn't mean you'll identify with it. And often,
Exactly.
the reason pop music shines, I think, above a lot of other genres is because it's less about whatever the nebulous quality of the music is. It's more about what you pull from the music, whether it's the lyrics, the rhythm, the percussion, the synth, whatever. But like, it's
Right.
something you connect to. And I think, especially with Superman themes, it's the same thing, right? Odds are, like Doctor Who and some other pop cultures, your Superman is also going to be your favorite Superman theme because you're so close to it.
I don't want to tangent into the excitement that I had when David Tennant was announced to come back for the coming season.
You and me
But,
both.
I will say I agree with that. I'm curious for everybody on the call right now, what in particular about music are you drawn to initially when you first hear a record? Be it any of these themes that we're going to be reviewing, but also just in general when it comes to music.
I mean, for me, I think it's emotionality. I mean, Dan knows this. I've gushed to Dan about his music and how I connected to it. And so like an emotional hook is going to get me before anything else does. Like if you write a sappy song about love or about heartbreak or about struggle, and it's the emotion's real to it, I will connect to that before anything else. Like the musicality and the composition is important, but I think because I'm an empath, that's just what I hone in first when I'm listening to music.
Jay, Mike, I'm going to go last because I'm lame. So go.
I mean, I don't have anything to follow that up with. They went really deep, and I was not expecting that this early.
I'll volunteer if you would like to brainstorm.
Sure, go for it.
Weirdly enough, like I know, Matt, you've said in regards to my music how much you are drawn to it and like the sort of the expressiveness and the emotionality of it. But weirdly enough, that is usually not the first thing that catches my ear when I start listening to something. And maybe it is something in particular as it correlates to the Superman themes, but I'm usually so honed in on groove and rhythm and beat, and very particularly with the case of all of the Superman themes for the most part, there is usually some sort of rhythmic element that, case as you mentioned, gets your heart pumping because it's like suddenly like it's sort of like you're like, oh, what's gonna happen? What's next? You know?
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is going to be an interesting one because music for me is a very contextual thing. I really respond to visual stimuli that corresponds to music. I really respond to the circumstances in which I hear it. Like I often talk about how I really didn't like listen to music regularly until I got a car and I was driving and listening to the radio a lot. Like music videos are often a big touchstone for me, or often referencing like, oh, this was used in that movie or on that show, and that's usually where I go to first. And like my wife has a degree in music, was an opera singer, like has all these like touchstones on music, and every time she'll reference a song, I'll be like, oh, it was from that movie, and she's like, why do you think that? Like,
Yeah.
why does your brain work that
I
way?
have a very similar kind of brain as you. Like I'm very much visual oriented. Like whenever I listen to something, I am imagining a sequence happening in my head. It's
Yeah.
almost like it's some sort of weird, like, because I I had a conversation with a couple of collaborators of mine a few years back on Twitter. I was like, wait, hold on, you don't hear or see a scene happening in your head as you're listening to a song? And they were like, no. You probably have some sort of weird form of synesthesia for like that feels like it's a form of synesthesia. And I was like, maybe it is. And like I've heard of different degrees of like it's not necessarily matching a note with a color, but like I think that is some sort of form of contextual synesthesia, and where you're like you have some sort of visual stimulus that you pair with the audio stimulus to create some sort of echoic memory in your brain, and sort of an emotional memory of the feeling of you experiencing the music.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Like I used to make anime music videos back in the day when that was popular, before YouTube became the
boy.
dominant
Yes.
thing, and then copyright shut down. Like
to find
you can
those.
find some of them that I was able to re-upload later, but like for a long time they kept on getting like wiped out. But it would be such a natural thing to be like, oh, well, I've got footage, and how can I like fit this to music and like play around? Like
Yeah.
that's how music would come to mean something to me, was by having something built around it.
That's awesome.
And like you said, like building a scene or something like that was a big way for me to do stuff like that. Like I spent so much time taking the footage from the the opening of Warcraft 3, and like there's a spot where like an orc is drumming and like modifying the beats so it match up to a Linkin Park song.
I love that. God, that's so 2000.
Classic.
Oh yeah.
Oh, that's great.
That's how I taught myself video editing.
Oh my gosh.
I feel like that's how we all taught ourselves video editing. It was like we had to at least like we found a song that we all liked, and we're like, oh, I gotta put this to like some sort of epic visual, like Goku going Super Saiyan or something like that, you know?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that didn't happen a lot in college. Like you'd walk in somebody's dorm, they just have like their music playing in the background. It'd be like a Naruto video or a DBZ video with like a whole bunch of tracks mixed over it, and like people do that.
Yeah.
I didn't
And that is
know.
the beautiful thing about the internet is that we can contextualize music in all sorts of different ways, and where it's like I learned about this band or this artist through watching AMVs on YouTube or something like that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's so cool. And then just like you just have so many different sort of layers to the experience of how you come to meet an artist or you come to meet a work, in especially when tying it back to the idea of a Superman theme. There's so many different ways that you can meet some sort of piece of music as you go through life.
Yeah, so let's talk about these works, and we'll talk about the work that it's associated with, like the specific iteration of Superman. And I know not all of you have listened to or watched all these. I've only seen some of the episodes of some of these shows anyway, so it's not like we need to go deep on all that. But like we'll talk about the context of the theme, like what it's coming from, and we might as well just go chronologically on this one, since otherwise I think we'll just go insane, and also we need like. We're either going chronologically or reverse chronologically. We're not doing jumping around. So we're going to open with a radio show. And I put that on the list thinking that, like, in my head, I was like, oh, yeah, there's definitely a theme. And I don't, like, when I then actually, like, queued up an episode, I was like, oh, wait, there isn't. It's just really a narrator. And then there's, like, backing track, but it's not specific. It's not like a general one. It's specific to the episodes that, like, bleed in to like, here's the plot for this episode kind of stuff, because it was a radio show, and you know there's a lot of just like incidental music that they put in the back. So I put it on the list, but there's not really much to say. Like it's really just like faster than a speeding bullet, once they got to that whole narration, because the radio show, it took a while for them to actually get to that point. It was like like a couple of years before they had like the copy down to like the tightest version that we all now know and associate with Superman.
Yeah. What I do find fascinating about the theme, though, is like I commented this on the document. I was like, it feels more like Batman orchestration. Like there's so much more like of an ominous tone that the orchestrations of the incidental music takes, and I think that just might be indicative of like the era that it lived in. Batman, I feel like, from an orchestration standpoint, a lot of the angle went more pulp as the years went on. Like they took the elements of the pulp incidental music and sort of wove it into the fabric of who Batman was as a pulp detective character. Meanwhile, you have Superman as more like a pulp fiction character, and not figuring out exactly what that character would be. I mean, it's more like, as this sort of described in the radio thing, is like it was more a symbol of the oppressed rather than necessarily like truth, justice in the American way, and which was kind of like the main arc of the identifying themes of the character over the last like 75 years that it existed. Like the first 25 were just like, no, this dude is just a champion of the oppressed peoples, and kind of comes from working class origins, even though he is incredibly like, he's one of the luckiest dudes in the world in the sense that he just like by sheer happenstance he happens to fall on a planet that gives him superpowers.
Yeah, we recently talked about Action Comics #1 on the show, and one of the things that was really interesting to look at there was that there's this recurring theme of he doesn't want people to like see references in the news about Superman. He just wants to do the good and have it be kind of in the background. And there's this air of mystery that was part of Superman when he was created, because he's so different from everything that had come before him in terms of like what type of hero. It's a science hero. Like it's not even like a gift of God or like of the gods or magic. Like it's just like, oh no, like ants are super strong, grasshoppers can leap really far. This is a weird miracle of science that is here to help. Like literally, it's on the first page of Action Comics that they're like, how does his powers work? Oh, science, ants.
Yeah.
Weirdly making him more like Spider-Man than I think I realized.
Yeah, that's actually true. That's so true.
But you're right. Like the earlier stuff is more of this sort of mysterious kind of element as opposed to the more explosive stuff we would get later.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and I said this in my notes too. Like this, though, from the beginning, in accordance to what Dan was saying about it being kind of more dramatic and like ominous, like this has the capital D drama that we associate with Superman themes, right? Because all of them are dramatic. I mean, that's probably the guarantee of a Superman theme, even from the more modern ones, is like there's this build-up, there's a release, there's this kind of plotting nature to it as you're kind of almost going through a narrative. And it fits well to this voiceover. I think that I more remember this theme because I remember those intros of the radio show when I would listen to them with my father, but not so much the actual instrumentation. Listening to this and trying to hear it through the narration, like it's not super clear. It's fine. It's definitely not meant to be a theme. It's more meant to be, I think, composition and guidance for the opening of the show and then the rest of the show itself.
J Mac, do you have any thoughts on the radio show stuff?
Faster than a speeding bullet. No, that's all. I always remember this because I used to spend these summers with my grandmother. She used to take me to the library all the time, and we used to listen to these.
Oh, wow.
Amongst, like, the Frank Sinatras and all the other stuff that she always make me listen to. But she used to, like, our old library used to have the cassette tapes, copies of these. And I was like, wow, this is pretty cool. It's super old, and it sucks, but it's pretty cool. Well, I guess as I got older, I came to appreciate it.
Well, and this is what we're talking about, like context-based appreciation of auditory stimuli.
The next theme that we're going to go to after this, the Fleischer cartoon, like that is all context for me. Like my love of this theme is 100% context because and for you youngins like Dan, might not remember these things called VHS cassettes. They were like tape, but they had video on it.
Oh, come on. I was in the VHS era.
But like,
I was in the era of millennials where everything was in the middle.
That's true.
I was like in between everything from like they would teach you how to do they had typing classes in school.
Mavis Beacon.
But then and you had like VHS tapes to play and cassette tapes to play music and VHS tapes to play videos. But then all of a sudden, boom, internet happened and suddenly MySpace was a thing.
Right, exactly. But like the Fleischer cartoon,
you can't skip a step in there. All of a sudden, those discs and DVD.
But no, the Fleischer cartoon. Like I had a bunch of them on VHS. I would watch them on loop as a kid. Like I had an early love for Superman, though he's not. And I've said this on the show before. Not one of my favorite heroes. He's a hero I do like, and like, and it's tied to. Look, we're not going to get into my credibility as a superhero lover because I'm not going to fight for Hal Jordan again. I'm tired of fighting that battle. He's the best Green Lantern, and that's it. Anyway, but no, seriously, the Fleischer cartoon is just so ingrained in my brain. Like the early scene in one of the first episodes where there's like a mad scientist and like the electrodes, and he's like and Lois is kidnapped, and like I picture all of that listening to this because I watched those cartoons so much. And while, again, it's not my favorite, it's the one that I think I remember the most strongly because I have that childhood association with it before any other version of a Superman anything.
Yeah. Before we go too far onto it, I do want to give credit. There wasn't really anyone to credit for the radio show, but for the Fleischer cartoon theme, it's by Sammy Timberg, and then uncredited was Winston Sharples and Lou Fleischer who composed this. And Matt, I think you're totally right in that this is like the real prototype for all the Superman themes to come after. You know, this is the one that set the tone. Like I remember, I think it was Paul Dini. Or may have been Bruce Timm on one of the commentary tracks for the animated series talked about how the secret to a Superman theme is that you have horns that say Superman.
I was gonna say it. I was like, does anybody else hear Superman every single time you listen to a Superman theme?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like if it's a good one, it has that. One we'll talk about later. There's an inversion of it, but yeah, the horns here. It's like Superman. Like you can hear it in the horns, but again, they don't have the words, and I think that's where you get really strong themes that that sells the emotionality of it all. Like it it really resonates in a way that doesn't require language.
For sure. Well, and like also, and I hinted at this before, this set the standard for strings and horns equaling Superman. Like musically, from every other theme after this, just about has a version of that. They may invert it or subvert it or maybe even do more electronic versions of them, but they are there and they are required. I mean, even obviously the incredible theme for this show composed by Geoff Moonen has a synthetic version of those things, right? Like it's an electronic version of what Superman theme should have. And like, I think that I always knew that in the back of my head, just like the horns yelling Superman thing, but I don't know that I ever vocalized it or heard someone vocalize it until today. And I'm like, oh yeah, of course.
That makes perfect sense.
People are hearing this too, right? I'm not just going insane.
Right. And I will say, of all the themes that we're going to talk about today, this is the most chest puffing out. Like when I'm doing yard work and I'm like doing something particularly hard, like, carrying like a heavy bag of of compost or moving mulch around or anything like that. This is the song that I put in my head of being like, like
I think my interests have changed over the years because it was this one and the John Williams one. I'm like, oh man, these are great. Then I heard one later on, we're going to get to it. And I was like, I think I changed my mind.
Interesting.
I'm just saying that like this is a really big, strong. Like normally, most of these themes are like there's a subtitle on it of Superman's March or something to that effect. It's considered a march, and I think that this one is really the most like Superman as like a strongman type, as opposed to some of the other ones will eventually become more of like Superman as a savior or a messianic figure. This is one where it's just like you could see him as like a circus performer coming out and lifting up the craziest, heaviest weights, like juggling elephants or some shit like that.
I can picture it in my head of just like hearing the and like him just going, haha, look at this. These are actually just balloons, but look at this.
Or do the good trick of having the weights, like have people come up and try to lift it, and no one can until you have one person. And it turns out that it was a magnet all along holding it down.
It reminds me, I've been weird tangent. My whole house has been going through One Piece, and there's this one weapon that Usopp, the sniper, uses. It's Usopp's 10,000 kilogram hammer, and it is just like two magnets that kind of are like 10 pounds only, and so like it seems super big, and it's just like boop, and the balloon pops, and then all of a sudden you see the two magnets on there, and it's just like makes me think of that really like just like. And I guess maybe that speaks to the whole idea of like everybody's kind of like pulling all of these very like pulpy, circusy type influences into and weaving it into the fabric of their hero storytelling, which I think is really fascinating. It's just like everybody seems to be, even when we don't think we are, we're pulling from all the same sort of sources that have entertained us for so many years.
Yeah. So why don't we move on to the next one, which is the George Reeves themes, or like the theme for the George Reeves Adventures of Superman show, which. So it's credited to Leon Klatskin. It's really similar to the Fleischer one, but it's not the same. It's like subtly different at a few spots, and then there's narration that kind of drowns it out, which by definition, I think that makes it a less effective Superman theme.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Although, I mean, in some cases, people would probably, of a certain age, would argue, like, this was my Superman. And I think as soon as they would hear that theme, they'd be like, oh, I know exactly what, like something that we've always seen, but it's just like we experience it in a different way in the sense of like that was what was happening at the advent of television, like these kinds of serials. And I'm like, I wonder what I'm trying to get into the headspace of like, I wonder what it was like to experience that for the first time for people who might not necessarily have seen the Fleischer cartoons, but like suddenly came into the era of television with this sort of presence of the theme.
I mean, I love the George Reeves show, and like I grew up watching it because on Nick at Night they always played it like on weekends and stuff, and and my dad loved, like my love of Superman comes from my father who grew up loving Superman and like saw, of course the Christopher Reeve Superman opening night, which we'll get to in a bit, but for me, I associate more with this show the visuals than the sounds, right? Because of the Foley and sound effects, and also like my favorite thing about this show, and I've said this I think on here before, if not just a case in passing, is the compilations of George Reeve just busting through walls. to be Superman.
They're amazing. Yeah.
Like those collections, and like because like how do you show how powerful Superman is back then? Well, you build a bunch of styrofoam walls and just have him bust through them, and like it didn't matter how much soot he got all over himself. Like he never broke character. He always like delivered, and like that the visual element of this show stands out more to me than this theme. It's fine. I mean, you're right. It's very similar to Fleischer, but like it is not. I don't associate it with the memories of the show. Those kind of memories stand on their own.
Yeah. Likewise, the narration, I think I remember better than the actual theme when I think back to the opening of the show. Like, even now, like, I just listened to them right before we started recording, and I'm like, I know they're different from the Fleischer one, but it's like in very small ways. It's very similar to later ones we're going to talk about that are dealing with the influence of the John Williams score. And in this case, it's just like, all right, well, there's a few notes that are different here, and then it obviously drops down so that you can hear the narration going over it that's doing the classic, faster than speedy bullet, more powerful than locomotive, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. Look, up in the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane, it's Superman. Yeah. Battle.
Which is in like everything after this too.
Right. Yeah. So I don't have that much to say besides like there's like a soft kind of spaciness to the opening. There's like a star field in the credits, and like the music sounds like it's like I don't want to say it's like a harp, but it's like something kind of like that. It's like a softer string before we get into the more the horn section of that's straight from the Fleischer stuff.
Almost like a precursor to Star Trek to some degree.
Yeah, a little bit like that. I was thinking, and I don't know off the top of my head the Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers kind of musical scores. Like I can't think, but like I know Star Wars is derived from that from a conceptual level. So I wonder if this was just like the way of conveying science fiction.
Oh yeah. That could be true.
Yeah, and I don't know, so I don't want to like go too deep on that one. But like it caught me immediately as soon as I heard it and I saw the Starfield. I'm like, that all reads. Space.
I think more often than not, when we have those sorts of cues of like when we have a specific chord progression that somebody plays, I think there's again the whole idea of sense memory, that I think there is definitely a very like peculiar and particular thing that comes to mind when any certain chord progression plays. So like when you have some sort of like curious sounding chord progression, it's almost always associated with some sort of scientific advancement, scientific achievement, space, all that kind of stuff, where it's just kind of like this inquisitive nature to it to some degree.
So why don't we move on to the New Adventures of Superman, the cartoon from the 60s.
This feels like watching the episode of Super Friends.
It's very different from the rest. So this one's by John Gart, although he's credited as John Marion, which, Super Friends or like Space Ghost or like the Galaxy Trio, the Herculoids.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the Justice League.
You could tell that all of those cartoons by Hanna-Barbera were not only influenced by like mod culture and all that kind of stuff, but like Neil Hefti's theme for the 66 Batman show, and where kind of like it's weaving together like very, very like quote unquote modern elements of pop music of the time to be like really like hip and jive to appeal to the kids.
Yeah, this one, like, and I think this is probably kind of unanimous amongst everyone here, is kind of like my least favorite. But it's serving its purpose, right? Like this was clearly designed in the vein of Space Ghost and Birdman and all of that stuff. Like to just kind of have this kind of hokiness to it, this cheesiness, which is also pretty inherent in Superman, right? Like there's a little like wink and nod in most Superman early stuff, at least. Like it does get darker and more serious for sure at times, but like there's always kind of a wink and nod. He is the strong man. He is the like the handsome, hair curled kind of like pompous superhero. Like that's the pomp is part of it. And that's here. But it's more performative. It's designed to like get kids excited in the same way like even G.I. Joe and Ninja Turtles and stuff that came after did the same. It's of that ilk.
Exactly.
Yeah, Matt, you're entirely right on like there's always a wink built into it. Like Superman is like one of the iconic ways of looking at Superman is him winking at the audience.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And like this one, like okay. So again, obviously, if it has lyrics, I'm going to think it's probably a lesser Superman theme. But I was when the chorus comes in and they're like Superman, the Man of Steel. I was like, what the fuck is this?
Yeah.
It's just kind of like implied horns, not all out singing Superman. Like that's the difference.
Contrary to that, you have the Spider-Man theme at the same time, which is interesting. Is that in that like it almost seems like that Spider-Man theme is so inherently tied to that character, which is
and the lyrics.
yeah,
for sure.
which is really interesting because I think they're trying to go for the same kind of feel in the way that they're trying to describe Superman.
Yeah.
For sure. And that's true, right? Because like we sing the Spider-Man. Like we love, like as a society have loved that song, whereas this one, which is doing a very similar thing, I kind of repulsed against. I was like, this isn't Superman. What is this nonsense?
Yeah.
But I think that speaks to the nature of, or like the differences between the two characters. Like while Spider-Man benefits from the degree of anonymity that like a full body costume has, so you could imagine anyone under the costume and it doesn't really require anything like that, it still feels like a more specific idea than where Superman, I think, is so broad as a concept. Like that's why like I really respond to him not having lyrics, because it should just sort of translate to like hope and optimism and all the emotions you want to invoke with Superman, but you don't need to like say it.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Like it should transcend words.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so that's it. Like we haven't talked about the New Adventures of Superman cartoon yet on the show. We're going to at some point, and it's I mean, it's just thoroughly of its era.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
you know, like
Without a doubt.
And this is probably the one where you can start to see Superman being molded into formats that exist or that are existing at the time, and trying to make him feel like the other cartoons of the day, so that he doesn't feel weird in that space. And we'll see that again in other stuff we're going to talk about. But this is probably the first time where it's like really trying to fit Superman to a medium, as opposed to him just sort of naturally. Like the radio show is where Superman got his start. Like really, like I mean, yeah, sure, comics, yes, obviously Action Comics #1, but like so much owes to the radio show. Most of our iconography goes back to that, and likewise, the Fleischer cartoons were groundbreaking at the time. No one had done cartoons like that before. They pitched a ridiculously high number because they were like, "There's no way they'll greenlight this project," and then they got greenlit because Superman was such a cash cow at the time. So they're like, "Fuck, I guess we have to revolutionize animation." Okay,
Don't mind us.
But here, this cartoon is very much just of that ilk of all the Hanna-Barbera and whatnot cartoons that were coming out in the 60s, because all of a sudden they could make cheap cartoons that could just go on TV, and it's just part of that. So it's okay, but it's definitely it's my least favorite of this list.
For sure.
Yeah.
So then we get to the big one.
Yeah.
So we jump from the 60s to the 70s.
Weirdly enough, this actually isn't even my favorite John Williams orchestration or theme. I'm pretty sure. I think
I mean, he's done so much that's not an understatement
I know.
level.
Right.
There's so many
but I
different
mean, like
things you could pick.
it's like one of the most iconic. It's like when you think about like what melodic ideas or chord progressions and stuff are like not iconic, because it isn't. I guess it is to some degree iconic because again, you're trying to picture the image with the audio of the piece. But it's also very echoic in the way that like we sort of just know it as the identifier for this is Superman. But I think my favorite John Williams themes, plural, are the ones that he wrote for Hook.
I mean, those are great. Those are great scores. So
Yeah.
like, I mean, like I can see that. I mean, so we're obviously tiptoeing around it. This is the John Williams Superman score made by John Williams.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
But I think, like, I'm with you, Dan. I think that, like, I think Star Wars will always live a little bit above this just because of my love for that being a little larger than my love for Superman. But one thing I will say about this score specifically and this Superman theme is it still gives me chills on the climb every time.
Yes.
Star Wars
Yes.
does not do that. I love Star Wars, and it warms my heart, and it fills me with emotion.
Right.
But the dun 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 dun, like the slow build of this song is unparalleled to any other theme before and after. And like that build, you know, I know it's coming. I know when the roller coaster is going to go over, and yet I'm like I'm gripping, waiting for it to go on that ride. Like every time, it's just, this is what I want from Superman themes. And you'll notice as we go through the list, my favorite Superman themes do this in different ways. But like every time I hear the song, I get chills. It's just one of the best constructed introduction themes in movie history, I feel like.
They're going to come after us when they hear this. Oh, man, you just said that this was better than the Star Wars theme. They're going to kill us.
Star Wars fans have enough to complain about. They're not going to bother.
Get those guys.
TV show coming out. They'll be mad about that.
They've got lots to bitch about. But, like, I mean, it's such an interesting run for John Williams just in general, because Star Wars is the year before this. Then we got Superman, and then we have Indiana Jones, like, just right after that. And, you know, before that was Jaws, and, you know, there's, like, all kinds of stuff right after that. But, like...
He is a master of taking Pulp Fiction and orchestrating it to, like... the nth degree, to where like every single time a music cue is played in any one of those movies, it feels like it is pulp on steroids.
And I mean, that is a big part of 70s filmmaking, like taking a lot of things that were conceits for either children or just like general audience, but like were usually considered like pulpier and less sophisticated, and putting this much more elegant touch on it all. And I think the music really does a good job of that. Because, like, you know, Jaws, people talk about, oh, it's a bog standard monster movie, until you get into the interesting cinematography of Spielberg and the fabulous score from Williams. Star Wars is Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon and all these like pulp sci-fi stuff. And then you get into the special effects that were like groundbreaking at the time, and the amazing score by John Williams. You know, Superman is the first big franchise property adapted into a blockbuster for the summer, and starts a wave that we are so deep into now with like the MCU and everything. And a big part of that was like a charming performance by Christopher Reeve, like a Richard Donner's attention to detail in the composition and trying to make it fit like different types of movies, and then this amazing score by John Williams. Like Indiana Jones is a Doc Savage movie, but with a little bit more of an everyman type hero, and an amazing score by John Williams.
Yeah, I think also ultimately why I love this theme so much is like there are some pop culture things that me and my father enjoy together, but for the most part, he's not a pop culture consumer. Like we have like Star Trek and Star Wars, but Superman was one of those things that since I was a kid, like I have a giant hardcover Superman. It's probably, I think, maybe the first 100 issues or whatever. It was like when they were doing those big hardcover, like colored books of like, it was a yellow Superman book, a red Batman book, and then another one or whatever. And so like, I have that still. And it's like, that's so closely tied to this movie's theme and like the Fleischer stuff. Like all of that is interconnected. And I think Superman for me is so tied to nostalgia in a way that a lot of other properties aren't. It might be also part of why I don't enjoy some of the modern stuff, is because of that tie to it as well. It's hard to say. But this theme was the start of like my love of music scores and pop culture and all of that mixing together, for sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is going to then cast a shadow on everything we talk about. You know, like we said, the Fleischer one was the prototype, and you can see how very similar things are going on here. The change in sort of the public perception of Superman had occurred at this point. He's no longer the big strong man. He now has way more of a messianic thing. There's lots of Judeo-Christian imagery going on in the 78 Superman movie. But this is taking all those ideas that were like, oh, this is the good stuff that's going on in the Fleischer cartoon, and making it into a theme that every single thing that we're going to talk about afterwards is either inspired by or in contrast to. So why don't we take the next one on the list is I've put some related properties on here just because like it's worth talking about. So we've got the Supergirl movie theme, which is by Jerry Goldsmith. And J-Mike, I regret that we didn't really get into the music when we were talking about the movie, because I actually had notes about it. We just sort of, we just moved on.
I mean, to be fair, we were trying to like move on from that movie as fast as possible.
I think we were all like a little bit harsher on it, but the music is great.
Really good.
I think the score is fantastic. Goldsmith has a big track record of trying to sound like other people in related franchises of things. And like here, it sounds like, I mean, my notes are specifically, it doesn't sound like Superman, but it feels like it's in the same family, which is exactly what you want for Supergirl.
Yeah, no, completely. And like, you know, my notes is it actually has kind of a hint of Magical Girl, like transformation and like, which like I'm sketchy on the timeline for Sailor Moon and the like, but I feel like around the same time or maybe shortly after this, but like definitely lending to each other. And like, I think that for something like Supergirl, it just felt like it could have been very easy to make this feel like wistful and feminine, whatever the fuck that means. And so like they don't do that here. They just make it feel special and magical and like otherworldly in a different way than the John Williams stuff does.
It's also interesting. I'm looking at his track record right now. It seems like he was always on also the cusp of just creating an unintentional Superman theme, because he also did the scores for like a lot of big sports movies like Hoosiers and Rudy. And like those have a lot of like, I mean, like those are more steeped in like Americana kind of like orchestrations. But to some degree, like I think a lot of the pulpy themes are rooted in that as well. So when you hear things like the Hoosiers, some of the Hoosiers orchestration or some of the orchestration from Rudy in particular, I think I get more of like the Clark Kent, Kara Danvers kind of like alter ego sort of feel out of that.
Yeah, I had a note that it feels very swashbuckling there. Like it's more adventurous than I think the Williams Superman score is. Like that's more like Superman's here and he's going to do good stuff as opposed to we're going on an adventure with this character. And I think that's a really strong selling point for the theme for that movie. I wish the movie had a strong thesis.
What case you didn't think the movie had a strong thesis? What, sir?
I think it was a wonderful candidate for another pass because there's some good ideas going on there, but like it was also half an advertisement for Popeyes.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And the invisible lightning monster.
I mean, tons of the like in it, and like the idea of her traveling from Argo City and whatnot is more adventurous than the child coming. You know, like the Moses type elements of Kal-El coming to Earth as a baby doesn't feel like an adventure so much as part of this larger, you know, poem. And like the element of not an adult, but like a teenager, like an active individual choosing to travel. There's more intent, and I think that the score here does a great job of conveying that. Shall we move on to the Ruby Spears Superman cartoon?
So, like, I love that this and the next track we're going to talk about it after it is just like a Pokemon evolution of more 80s version.
Like the most aggressive, like.
Yeah. And like this is a start of that, right? Like this feels 80s, but it still very much feels like John Williams here. Like
yeah, it's actually credited as John Williams on like as the composer. So even though there's some differences, it's still considered just the same score.
Yeah, and it does feel like, and you mentioned this in your notes case, like the X-Men pilot that came out around the same time and the G.I. Joe theme and like all of those kinds of, like even Thundercats, like those kinds of shows and like the epic 80s nature of those themes. You definitely feel that in this rework of this theme.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's definitely like just all of the instrumentation choices are very just like you can tell that like it was designed to be like, okay, we're gonna make as many action figures for this cartoon as possible.
Yeah, I don't know what instrument or whatnot it is, but there's like a light speed sound effect early in it, and like I don't know how you make that sound effect specifically, but like but you guys know what I mean.
Yeah,
when I
this
say
is
it's
like
like a
whooshing
light speed sound.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like there's all these elements in there where this is the other one I was really thinking about, where we're really jamming Superman into a format that was currently popular.
Yeah.
You know, like this is the era of like I said, or like the G.I. Joe stuff, like the X-Men pilot, like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Like this is the era where outsourcing to Japanese studios was really big. Like the opening credits are beautifully animated by Toei, you know. Like so it's so weird because like this you know, it has narration going over it that really emphasizes that he's for truth, justice, and the American way.
I made sure to hit him right in there.
But it's Japanese animation.
Yeah.
Like, and I think that's such an interesting component to the series. And like I only recently realized that the Ruby Spears series was a thing because I had seen like some specials. Like I saw the Wonder Woman episode when I was a kid, and then like had never really watched it, never really processed it, and then I just saw like a reference to like, oh yeah, the cartoon series from 1989. I was like, wait, the fuck? Because that would entirely have been in my wheelhouse, and I just missed it. So I watched it recently, and it's interesting about like where it falls and what they're trying to do with it and all that, but it's still it's still trying to jam Superman into a format as opposed to letting the character sort of define its role in the medium. It's the same, like just like the Hanna-Barbera 60s cartoon.
Yeah, 100%.
But we should move on to the Superboy theme, because the Superboy theme is more of what we're talking about and more deliberately what we're talking about. Because at least with the Ruby Spears one, it's still like technically John Williams. They just added some more like sound effects, and like they added a narrator to do the faster than speeding bullet, all that stuff. And then giant explosions with the Kents avoiding the rocket, which were crazy. But then the Superboy theme is okay. So it's by Kevin Kenner. I see some debate online about it's season 3. They changed the theme a little bit, and it's an uncredited change, so no one knows exactly who did the remix. But this feels like a royalty-free version of the John Williams score, combined with like 1990, specifically 1990 pop.
Yeah, I mean, this is what Dan was pointing out earlier. Like, this has like the electric drum, like do 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 do, like you would hear in Miami Vice or anything of that, like steeped in 80s kind of feel.
Yeah.
And like it's dripping with that. And like, look, I know y'all have talked about the Superboy stuff, and like it's hit or miss, but I like how honestly it is itself in this moment. Like, it's not trying to be Superman, it's trying to be a younger, hip Superman, which is essentially what Superboy was for this era and this show. And so like I respect that the theme fits the tone of the show, which is like, what if Superman was a little goofier and a little more like immature and like, you know, kind of, you know, focusing on what like a young Superman would be like / Superboy. And I think it works. It's definitely cheesy as hell. But again, there's an air of honesty in the cheesiness that comes with Superman, which I appreciate.
It makes the right choices for the kind of thing it is trying to be, for the right audience.
Yeah. Not too serious, just enough hokey. Pour in a ton of 80s.
Yes.
like the
Shake.
Yeah, like the Powerpuff Girls cartoon. You're adding all the ingredients.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, but I do think it works, but it does feel like it's constrained by the production values of the show. Like, everything about that show is a lot of great ideas, a lot of cool ways of implementing things, but they just didn't have the budget. And let's move on to the next live action interpretation of Superman on the big screen. Pardon me, on the small screen? The TV. TV is what I'm talking about.
TVs can be pretty big these days, but yes,
they're pretty big now, but they're not quite. Which is the Lois and Clark theme, which is by Jay Gruska.
Oh, interesting. Jay Gruska did that. That's cool.
Yeah, this show. So, I mean, I say this in my notes. It's too bad that Dean Cain is a giant douchebag now. But at the time, I loved that show, and I liked how cheesy and soap opera it was. I had like everyone else, I had a huge crush on Terry Hatcher, like everybody did at the time. Like,
I must make the point because CJ would kill me if I didn't
true.
make the point. He says that this is probably the best Lois Lane in his opinion.
I mean, I think it's one of.
Yeah.
I would say that she did one of the best versions of modern Lois Lane for sure.
Yeah.
And I would hate to anger CJ as well. He is a man that I love. But like, I think that this is not a great theme. Is it good for this show? And the show was designed for, yes. This goes back to what Case has been saying.
Right.
Like, this is another attempt to fit the format. This is a soap opera-y, romantic Superman show that centers around Lois and Clark and their relationship as much as Superman. And this is one of the earliest times that we see that, right? Like, it's pretty standard now to feature Superman's personal life as well as being a superhero. But in the old cartoons, no one wanted to see that, they thought. Everyone was like, oh, I just want to see him be Superman. And so I appreciate what this show did for that and showing that relationship. But this theme is just like, it doesn't have the same oomph that a lot of the other themes before this have. It still has the strings and the horns, but like, it's just not the same like power that the other themes have had.
Right. Do you find I found it interesting. Do you think it takes more cues from the love theme that Williams wrote for Lois and Clark than necessarily
I can see that.
the main like I am Superman? And I feel like that would make a lot more sense because since it is Lois and Clark, The Adventures of Superman, it almost seems like they're really trying to play up that the Superman aspect of the whole thing is sort of the secondary bit. We want to focus on Lois and Clark, really. So we'll take a theme that is more inspired by that.
Yeah, it's good you bring up the love theme because we aren't really going too deep in like the broader scores on some of these pieces. Like, obviously, if it's a movie, there's lots of songs. There's not just the singular like main opening theme song. And the love theme is fantastic. It's such a wonderful piece of music. It played at my wedding.
It did. It's true. I can vouch for that.
So I think that's an apt point, at least in terms of structure. But I feel like looking at this theme, that it is just going through the motions in terms of trying to hit the right beats. Like, technically, it's got the horns that I want for a Superman thing. It doesn't have a narration over it. So it's all the check boxes that I'm looking for. It checks. But I don't feel like it really builds to anything. Like, it kind of just feels like it's the love theme if it was just you sampled like the middle like 30 seconds of it, as opposed to like having any sort of build or any kind of climax to it, which is kind of a bummer because like the show, I mean, I think this sort of works for a lot of the show, which is that it was good for the time, but it's limited by what they could do on like network television and like what kind of show they're trying to build it for, because it's trying to reach some very different audiences. Like, it's like superhero action and also like a... a love story comedy.
It almost seems like it's a proto CW show.
Yes.
to some degree.
Yeah, absolutely. You are 100% correct, Dan. Yes.
Is this where it all started? Oh my god.
As a strong defender of the CW shows, I am glad that it is here to pioneer the subgenre of aggressively normal to absolutely insane CW shows.
Well, when we get to them, there will be plenty of CW love for us to have on this one. But, I'd say rounding out the Lois and Clark stuff, like, it's fine.
Yeah.
It's not my least favorite on this list, but it's definitely not my favorite. And it's not even on the top half. So why don't we move on to the Superman, the animated series theme, which, as would be befitting for most of the animated stuff, is by Shirley Walker, who did most of the themes for the Dini-verse. This is my favorite, guys.
Yeah.
It's the thing about the Superman the Animated Series show, and we talked about this on the episode I guested on, where we talked about the show. And for the record, this is the first time I've been on this show with J Mike, because when I was on the show earlier for that, you weren't here. You weren't around. But no, like, this is my Superman. This is my Superman show.
Yep.
This is my Superman theme. Like, I have gotten to tell Tim Daly to his face that he is my voice of Superman. When I read the comic books, I hear his voice.
Yo, that's wild.
Which was so incredibly awesome to get to do. And he was, of course, lovely about it and took it as the compliment I meant it. But, like, this theme is a big part of that love. Like, again, talking about growing up and, like, being immersed. Like, I hear this song, I hear this march, and I see that opening, vignette of Superman being Superman.
Yep.
It's just, it's the da-da-da, da-da-da. Like, I love, like, it does the build that John Williams does, but in a different way. It's not as dramatic, but it still has the march. It still pumps you up. And I think it took an initial formula and did nothing but make it better and grow it into something that surpasses what it was trying to inspire from.
I'm going to take a moment to, like, acknowledge the absolute genius that is Shirley Walker, because I feel like she took sort of musical identities that we had already familiarized ourselves with in the forms of both Batman and Superman and reinterpreted them to some degree where it still feels like it maintains the semblance of what the original idea was melodically and chord progression wise, but then adds an additional flavor of it that just, I don't know how to describe it other than it is different in the best possible way, in the sense of, like, it is a new shade of the same thing that I like, but it is a shade that makes it all the more endearing to me.
100%. I mean, like, we're not here to talk about Batman, but, like, the Batman theme that she did, it's absolutely, inspired by the Danny Elfman theme, but, like, definitely is its own thing, to the point where I used to confuse them, and now they sound so different to me.
Yeah.
But it's clearly, she knows how to take inspiration without recycling it like some other themes have.
Exactly.
She absolutely makes it her own, like you said.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think especially here, because like the Batman the Animated Series, just in general, was kind of sort of being built off of the initial Tim Burton Batman films. Like, so there's a lot of style elements that are, like, carried over from it, and even though they're their own standalone works, it was at that time when, like, cartoons were just being built off of pre-existing movies all the time, and so there's an element of that there, and that theme holds closer, whereas this one is trying to be way more distinct. I mean, like, obviously the Williams score heavily influences this,
right?
But you can really see that, like, there's just something really special about it. Like the beats where, like, in the, again, contextual. So, like, looking at the opening credits, like, when you see, like, young Clark, like, running, and then it cuts to him flying as Superman. It's like the way the music just sort of, like, underscores that. It's so perfect. And then we get, like, some nice elements going on, like it's more complex than a lot of these themes. Like, there's like different sections of it is trying to tell you the story of, like, what the show is about, and, like, the section that's sort of like the lowest theme of it all, where it gets a little bit softer and a little bit more introspective, like, just wonderful stuff. And, like, the music of the show is great, but, like, this theme, like, just tells you, like, oh, this show is going to be Superman, but it's all the best types of Superman stuff, and it's going to be in a way that isn't talking down to you.
I'm gonna break formation here and be like, oh, for me, I'm gonna catch a lot of heat for this, but for me, this was just okay.
Really?
Interesting.
And I was like, oh,
That's
No
cool.
heat.
online. I'm talking about this. We're like, oh my gosh. This is,
I can't control the internet, unfortunately, J-Mike. Sorry, can't help you there.
yeah, we don't have $50 billion. Anyway, yeah, this is just okay. Like, it was a good theme, but this is definitely not out of my top 5. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Case.
No, it's totally fine.
It goes back to what we talked about before, right? That your initial, like, it sounds to me, J-Mike, like a lot of your impact for Superman in media has come from like the John Williams stuff and like
Well,
those
like, it's
movies.
crazy because I grew up watching this like every day after school.
Sure.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I grew up watching this every day after school. And I was like, oh, okay, Superman's on, and then like Justice League happened, and Justice League Unlimited, and I was like, oh, this is so cool. And I was like, oh, you know.
Weirdly enough, I think the Justice League still takes cues from the Superman theme to some degree, but it just feels more like regal in the approach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like you're like,
for sure.
Well, it feels like the Knights of the Round Table that
Yes.
Superman is like the King Arthur
Yes.
for, to a certain degree. One I didn't put on this list, but I want to shout out is the Superman Batman,
Yeah.
Right, when they were teamed up.
which I think does such a wonderful job contrasting those two elements, because it has this like dark somberness to it, and then it'll like Superman, like when he, again, context, so the images, when Superman shows up on the screen, it all of a sudden like explodes with horns to like take you away from the Batman, like this more like cellist
I forgot
kind of
they
style
did like
that's
a
going on.
Power Hours to some degree on the
They
Kids
did.
WB,
Yeah.
and like that had its own distinct theme.
Yeah.
Oh, but
Yeah.
I remember it
And
so
it was really
well.
good. I'm sad that I didn't put it here because I just didn't think to, because I was trying to think of as many Superman themes as I could, and I regret that I didn't mention it.
Yeah, I mean, I think J-Mike, it makes sense though that like it doesn't seem strange to me that this isn't your favorite, only because again, it's not only just identifying to the Superman media, but also there's a wealth of great Superman themes. Like we've talked about
is.
what our favorites are, but like I would say almost all of these are good to great.
Yes.
None of them are particularly awful, and so that makes sense to me. It's like picking your favorite Beatles track, right? Like
Yeah.
for the most part, or your favorite Queen track. Like they're all great,
Yeah.
but there are some that are better.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that you can say that of themes of Superman, because if you're trying to create something for this character, there is that kind of next level feeling to it.
Yeah, exactly.
Someone out there thinks that Obla Di Obla Da is their favorite song.
Those people are wrong, but it's fine. Come for me, I guess.
Beatles heads.
I will say, though, the next song that we're going to discuss is probably one of my least favorites, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah, so why don't we move on to that? So next up is just as different as you could get.
Yeah.
So next up, we're talking about the Smallville theme, which is actually the song "Save Me" by Remy Zero.
Right.
Like, so here's the thing, right? Like, and we're going to talk about this in another episode, but like pop culture and Superman go hand in hand. There have been tons of songs about Superman or about Superman's the characters in Superman's world. This is like one of the only times I can think of where a main show uses the pop song as a main theme. And this also is very in the ilk of the CW stuff that comes later after this, and has even paid homage to this since. But like, I like Remy Zero. I think they're a fine band. They're not anything groundbreaking from what I can recall of their discography, but like the song invokes Superman, but I think it's my least favorite because, like Kay said earlier, when Superman songs have lyrics, they just don't feel as powerful. They feel less dramatic. They feel more rote, and it's fine for what this kind of high school drama they were trying to tell. It fits the mood. I just don't genuinely like it that much.
Right. Yeah. I found it very funny that this song played when in Crisis on Infinite Earths when Tom Welling's Clark showed up.
Yeah.
It's so
This is very interesting.
I was like, what are we doing here? What are we doing?
I mean, it makes sense that they chose a song like this for this show, because Smallville, like, the rules that the producers had was no flights, no tights. It was very much trying to be like an un-Superman Superman show. And so this is like a Dawson's Creek.
Yes.
but
What if
it
Superman
technically is
lived in
Superman.
Dawson's Creek?
100%, yeah.
And it is a predecessor to the CW stuff. Like the later seasons get batshit wild and like are fully fit into the CW world. Like it just perfectly fine. But the original idea is like, all right, well, we're going to do a show that is just Roswell or Buffy or again Dawson's Creek, but it's going to be using Superman property stuff. And it's called Smallville so that like if you're not a Superman fan or rather, if you're a Superman hater, you might not know that it's a Superman thing until you start watching it, and then they're hoping like you might be hooked on it by that point. So, like, it's fine. The song, I think, is fine. I liked it enough as a theme song for it, in that it is trying to be Superman just happens to be in a WB teen drama, as opposed to a Superman show.
I feel like this was fine. Yeah, he's like, this is fine for that era. Like, every show had, at the end of every show, there was a pop song or something going off in the background. So it all kind of went together for the theme of the show for that week. I remember watching the show when it first came out.
Yeah,
it's kind of crazy that we haven't talked about Smallville yet on this show. Like, there's all these. There's so much material. Like, we're almost 100 episodes in, and we haven't talked about Superman 1 yet. So much. Superman 1, the comic, not the movie.
Right.
You got 100 years worth of material to work with.
That's very true.
Yeah,
you've got a big rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah. So, I mean, Smallville was the introduction for a lot of people to like the larger Superman mythos. Like, it was really popular. It ran for 10 seasons. Like, it did its job exactly what it needed.
They made the biggest deal out of the Green Arrow on that show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the earliest times that he kind of became mainstream besides the Justice League cartoon.
Yeah.
Which, of course, for me will always be my Green Arrow will be.
Yeah, that's true.
Will be that version.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Arrow wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for him.
Oh,
being a major
absolutely.
player.
Right.
Absolutely.
Like, I mean, it's kind of crazy. Like, it did so many things. It introduced me to Alan Ritchson, who I love, and now he's
he's Jack Reacher.
on everything.
It's wild.
I think it was exactly what it needed to be in terms of being like, all right, we're going to start seeding superhero stuff into formats that didn't previously do it, so that the W Smallville walked so that the CW Supergirl could run or fly, and like that's like I said, it did its job, but it was also trying to be a stealth show. It was trying to be like, no, it's not Superman. We swear. It's just green meteor rock. It's not kryptonite.
That's when they also
Wink,
brought in
wink.
like the 18 different flavors of kryptonite like every other week.
But yeah, why don't we move on to the next one, which is like getting back to a proper Superman score. And that is, we're talking about the Man of Steel score by Hans Zimmer.
Yeah.
This one, so Man of Steel gets a lot of hate, and I know that both of you, Case and J. Mike, fall kind of in the middle on it. You don't hate it, and I think that's the kind of the proper level-headed reaction, which the internet never has. Like, I will say that Henry Cavill is an incredible Superman. Regardless of the material he had to work with, he was incredible, and it paved the way for all of his other strong-jawed characters that he got to play, like Geralt now in The Witcher. But Hans Zimmer is a talented composer, but he has a bit. He has a shtick. He's the synth guy, and that's fine. Like, and I love his scores. His Wonder Woman theme is probably one of my favorite Wonder Woman themes.
That's true.
Ever. Like, it just
rips.
goes so damn hard. And Man of Steel does the same. And I think what it gets right is the dramatics, which we talked about earlier, and it absolutely has the horns and the strings, but it's all synthetic. It's all like designed to feel a little alien, which is interesting, right? Because a lot of the themes previous are very familiar, feel very, I understand this. Whereas this is meant to feel a little more alien, a little stranger, and a little more ominous. And I think for the movie we got, love or hate, it fits. And it works.
I think there is a better Superman movie within the context of this theme.
Yes.
Because the piano motive, it was very clearly designed to evoke Clark Kent. And the drum-y kind of themes. Like, I remember watching behind-the-scenes videos of like, oh, we were trying to evoke the epicness of Superman and the percussiveness, so we got like 50 of the best drummers into the same room to do the drums for this thing.
Yeah, because Pharrell was one of them too. They brought Pharrell in.
Yeah, Pharrell was one of them.
Oh shit!
But I really, and this is something that you'll hear from me, especially towards the end when we talk about the last Superman theme, is that I think I gravitate a lot more in terms of favorite Superman themes to the ones that speak more to the man than actually the superhero. And to me, the piano theme is very much a precursor to what we hear on Superman and Lois, in the sense of like it is speaking a lot to more of what I wished this interpretation of Superman with Zack Snyder was aiming for, which was the man. And like that at the end of the day, it's just a dude who's trying his best and trying to get through the world. And that's what the piano theme evokes to me. But then all of a sudden it gets washed into the whole of like a bajillion drums going.
Yeah.
And that's great. I think that's cool, but we've heard a lot of that in terms of the rhythmicness of a Superman theme.
Yeah, I think you nailed it on the piano, like evoking Clark Kent and talking about how it sounds more alien. Like I have a note specifically that this is the one where the horns are there and they are saying something, but they are not saying Superman. They are saying Kal-El. Like like when you listen to it, like you can hear Kal-El, Kal-El. Like there's this. It feels like this person finding out who
they are
he
very
is,
otherworldly
and then
to some degree.
Yeah, and that percussiveness is him being forced to identify himself in this like frantic pace of the movie. Like I say, it's not a march, it's a sprint. That once those drums pick up, he's got to make a decision, like which side is he on? Is he an alien or is he a man?
And an interesting thing that I just noticed, and I'm like, oh, this is definitely what the motivic development was for this film. Krypton's theme shares a similar progression to the Kal-El theme in the da 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 with the horns. Like instead of it going up, if I'm not mistaken, it goes down, or it goes down in a different way, because it was like da 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 or something like that, and it just, I think very clearly they were trying to weave more of the Kryptonian heritage into the Superman of it all.
Yes, I'm gonna be honest. This is my favorite Superman score.
Understandable.
Okay.
Yeah, because
I totally can see that.
It does, but like, I had a real love-hate relationship with this movie when it first came out, as Case can very well verify. And like, the more we learned about like the background, the history of everything that was happening at DC at that time,
yeah,
because they came up with Earth One Superman while this was with Man of Steel was being done, and
they did.
You see like what could have been.
Yeah, that's true.
It could have been, and then we got Man of Steel. But as for the music part, all the man, this score is very, it's very enrapturing. It's very like epic and iconic, and I'm like, oh wow, this feels amazing.
There's such a better movie in there.
Yeah, it's such a better movie in the score than what actually came on the screen. But this is my favorite. It's all right. I love it.
I mean, I think that there's a reason why this is not called Superman. This is called Man of Steel, which obviously is a callback to like his nickname, but like also is going to evoke the 1980s like relaunch of the character after Crisis on Infinite Earths, where it's a new origin for the character. And like all the themes we're talking about, all the things we like about this are things that are in the movie, which is this entity, this child sent to Earth, coming to understand who he is and deciding at the end of the movie to be Superman. Like it's his origin story, and so as a theme for the origin of Superman, I think it works really, really well. I think that once he's an established character, it starts to lose that because it is about him making the choice to be Superman, as opposed to having already decided to be Superman, which is what I feel like the John Williams score is.
And I feel like, look, Zack Snyder, take him or leave him, right? Like, I've loved stuff by him, I've hated stuff by him. But I think there is a care for this character in this movie somewhere. I think the problem is that he kind of gets lost in the minutia instead of focusing on the most important thing, which is he is a symbol for hope. Having a dark Superman story can work, but the hopelessness that's throughout the entire movie, I think, is what drags this down. And like, that hopelessness isn't in this theme or in the scoring. Like, there are allusions to Clark and hope, and I think that if the movie had more of that, it would have had a stronger impact than it did, because there is good in this film. And I think this theme is a good example of where that is. And who knows, right? A lot of stuff goes into movies. We don't know how much of it is Zach, how much of it is Warner Brothers, how much of it is whatever. But we definitely didn't get the movie that this theme led us to believe. And it's sad because it's definitely in there somewhere.
I also just really remembering really loving the trailers to this. Like,
Yeah, I was going to say that.
I went to a midnight premiere of The Dark Knight Rises, and I had known prior that we were going to get a sneak peek of this movie ahead of the Dark Knight Rises, and I just remember sitting there in the theater. I'm like, oh my goodness, they're gonna go all the way with this character, because the imagery was so beautiful. And like they used Gandalf's death theme to sort of evoke this really like balanced, textured feeling of what it might mean to take on the mantle of Superman. I'm imagining the trailer company did a really good job of saying like there's a really good movie in here in this kind of like very messy, more sci-fi angle to Superman.
Yeah, the trailer starts off with like a little kid running through the field, and then he puts on like the cape, and he's like standing there with his arms on the side, and I'm like, oh, this is gonna be amazing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it's getting that piano theme that Dan talked about at that spot. Yeah, like I said, it's really good for an origin, which means that it's really good for a trailer. Like everything about it from the outset, like looks amazing. Like again, Cavill is great. Like I think he looked the part perfectly. And I generally come down on Man of Steel being a good Superman movie. Like I'm more positive towards it than I think a lot of people are. I think that its follow-ups are the thing that kind of prevented from having like the great legacy. Like I think if it had a really strong sequel, then you could look at it as being like, okay, yeah, there were, there's a couple bumps, but it's like a pretty strong start to the franchise. And then, it's like Spider-Man 1 to Spider-Man 2. Like, but instead there's no Spider-Man 2. It goes to Batman versus Superman.
Can you imagine the world where we got a Man of Steel 2? I feel like we would think about it so much differently than we do.
Absolutely. It's so common especially in comic book movies, for a later sequel to justify an earlier movie. We talked about this all the way back on Another Pass when Case and I did the Wolverine. It's like Logan made that movie better because it alluded to stuff from that movie that made the narrative through line stronger, even though a lot of Wolverine's solo stuff at that time had not been great. And I think that you're absolutely right. I think a Man of Steel 2 that focused on him being Superman and coming to grips with that decision he made on General Zod and like living with himself and it inspiring him to do good instead of just being this dark moment would have given for a much better arc for this character instead of just yelling the name Martha.
Why'd you say that name, man? Why'd you say that name?
Anyway.
One thing I do want to contrast this theme to is that Zimmer also did then all the Dark Knight scores. And like I think that there is a shared element of the Dark Knight score has this like unrelenting, like Batman will keep trying no matter what you throw at him kind of feel to him. Like he's coming for you. He is a symbol of justice. He is coming, like no matter what you put in his way, he's gonna come at you. Like a train carrying a device that is evaporating all of the toxins in the atmosphere. He's coming for you.
And you know what the bummer is that Hans Zimmer actually did write a Batman theme, and they wove it into this fabric of Harvey Dent in The Dark Knight, and it plays a couple of times in Batman Begins, a couple of times in The Dark Knight, and they don't use it at all in The Dark Knight Rises, and I'm so sad about it because it's such a good Batman theme, and it would have been such a unique and interesting, like if it had become more interwoven into those films instead of like leaning on the percussion heavy and like the rising two-tone sort of motif that we know, it would have been a much more fascinating development of that character musically. Much in the same way that I wish that the piano motif and the percussive interpolation of it, once it sort of evolves in Man of Steel, I wish it went somewhere and was taken in a different direction. But it's just like there is Man of Steel is a movie with so much missed potential that I am more angry about its missed potential than I am about the actual movie itself.
That is a fair assessment.
Yeah. Well, because again, saying if we were to imagine a Man of Steel 2, if that Man of Steel 2 was then a continuation of the theme, and you took all the stuff that's going on here and resolved it into a way where it's like, now here is Superman, as opposed to the struggling individual who is he human? Is he alien? Is he a god? Like that I think is the challenge of the Man of Steel theme that is being presented, and I don't think it has an answer at the end. And I think that like a sequel theme would be so amazing because it's such a good foundation. But Zimmer wasn't really involved with the later stuff anyway. So what? Why don't we move on? Because like I don't want it just to be a Man of Steel conversation at this point. But it is going to color it because like the Zimmer score was an attempt at not sounding like the Williams score, and then later works are then going to have to contend with the fact that people like both, and particularly the next thing on the list, which is the Supergirl TV show theme. And for those who don't remember Supergirl when it first came out, they were very coy on its relationship to the broader DC properties. It was distinctly set as not as part of the CW stuff at the time. It wasn't on the CW for one thing. It was on CBS. And so they never showed Superman in like, he was in silhouette every time. And like, it kind of has design elements that lead you to think it's kind of like Man of Steel. And maybe it was a TV spinoff of Man of Steel. So I think there was a big push to make it like that. So the score, which is by Blake Neely.
That was really good.
I love. I think it's great.
Yeah. Shouts to Blake Neely, man. He's been doing literally all of those scores for every single, for nearly like every single show on the CW, I'm pretty sure. And the fact that he created, not only did he do such a great job at creating such an identifiable theme for Kara, Supergirl, that character, he's done that for Arrow, The Flash, even like a random super team, The Legends of Tomorrow, creating such identifiable themes for them. He has done such an excellent job at crafting what to me has become like distinct musical interpretations of the DC Comics characters.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I can hear the rolling orchestration of the Flash theme in my head while he's running. Like, that sound is so iconic now to that version of Barry Allen. And like, I love these shows. I didn't see any of them through. Like, I dropped off halfway through most of the seasons except for Arrow. I think I've seen all of Arrow. But like, Supergirl, I was there premiere time. Like, I was excited. It looked really cool. The actor playing Jimmy is someone I had seen in other stuff, and so I was excited to see him in this new show. And like,
he's great.
He's so great in it. And like, I love this interpretation of Kara. It made me fall in love with Supergirl as a character that I never really had before. Admittedly, I hadn't read a lot of Supergirl's comics either, but this score is very much a fusion of what came before, but still has the hope and the brightness that you especially relate to Supergirl as a character. And I think that's the strength of this theme versus a lot of the other ones. It gets heavy and dramatic like the classic themes without feeling overbearing and dark, but it still has the horns and strings doing the heavy lifting and making it still feel like an homage to not just Zimmer, but Williams as well.
Yeah. I mean, there's a criticism that some people levy at the CW show that it's more of a distaff counterpart to Superman than necessarily a Supergirl show. Like, there's a lot of elements that feel more like, oh, it's a Clark thing, but they've just made it Kara instead. And I think that's fair. And I think the theme here, like, it's not at all like the Jerry Goldsmith, nor am I expecting it to, but it certainly feels like it's being based on the big Superman stuff. Like, it's being based on the Man of Steel, and it's being based on the Superman 78 themes. And there's like a precociousness, like there's like a bubbliness to it that I think is evocative of the character and how they've made Kara different than Clark in this, that I really like. This kind of sounds like the culmination stuff that I was talking about, although the character is slightly different than Superman. So it you know, like I said, it bubbles a bit more than you would.
Kara as a character really hasn't had any sort of definitive interpretation in the comics either. They really kind of have zigged her and zagged her in all different directions to some degree.
Yeah, I think some fans would argue that there have been like definitive ones, but the counterpoint I would have is that those definitive ones are nothing like the other definitive ones. Like, she's had very strong takes in different series. Like, the New 52 take was like very strong in that it was like this much more radical kind of like almost like Namor type figure, like kind of like Marvel Boy from Grant Morrison. Like, it, you know, she's like not receptive to Earth. Like, she's like traumatized by Krypton and like kind of angry about it all, which all makes sense. But it's very different from like the girl from the orphanage in the 60s and like the 70s. Like, oh, she's like actually kind of a cool hip woman who has like awesome outfits. Like,
yeah. And I feel like this almost like in this show, it was almost like a synthesis of all those different facets of the character, because I think we did get that to some degree of like the challenge that she had to sort of wrestle with the loss of her home world and being consciously aware of it, while also at the same time just realizing that she kind of just needs to move on with her life, and sort of encountering the challenges along the way that had to deal with just like she's living with an adopted family and she has a sister and a new mother and a new father, and they kind of understand their place in the world. She doesn't really, and a lot of the course of the earlier seasons is her finding her place, and then sort of the last few were sort of her being thrown challenges that sort of cause her to rethink about like what she initially sort of came into being as Supergirl. It sort of challenges her to take a really hard look at who she is in general and like what it means to be her as a hero and a person, to the point where are you going to go back and watch any of these? Are you going to see the end of the show perchance?
At some point, but I mean, if you have a point to make based on how it ends, I'm not going to be upset about it.
In the final episode, she makes the conscious choice to reveal herself as Kara Danvers to the world, like as her being one and the same. It's kind of like the thing that has like it is the one thing that at the end of the series kind of she realizes is the last thing that's holding her back. And so in making herself one and the same, it's kind of just her showing herself finally to the world as the totality of who she is as a being.
I mean, I think that it's no secret that when this show started, they couldn't show Superman because DC and Warner Brothers were very much like, this can't exist because we have a successful Superman thing that we're planning. And as that started to tank, they went, maybe we should put Superman in this thing and try and fix it. And like, so this theme, taking it back to the music side of it, sounding so much like a Superman theme and this character being so much like Superman is clearly the creators going, I want to tell a Superman story, but I can't. So instead, why don't we take this character that's often overlooked or not portrayed well or has had a diverse past and make her as stoic and important as Superman. And I think while, yes, you can view it as like, well, Supergirl isn't that important, so let's just make her like Superman. The misogyny side of it, which I'm sure is in there somewhere, you can also look at it as the opposite of, well, no, actually, we're just making Kara center stage, something she's never really gotten to do because she, and talks about in the show, was always overshadowed by her cousin. And so, like, I love that aspect of it. I love it that she's front and center. This is probably one of my favorite versions of any of the super characters in this family. And I think this theme backs up that creation, you know, and when we talk about the next theme after this is only built off of this. I think this is such a great, strong starting point for this TV version of Superman that we have
Weirdly
now.
enough, it takes the elements of the Kryptonian thing that we were talking about before with the Hans Zimmer stuff and being like, making it really a definitive aspect of her life. And that makes sense because she is so much more aware of her Kryptonian heritage than Clark was. In the sense of, like, you see her more as Kara Zor-El as opposed to Kara Danvers, or her human identity.
Yeah. She didn't have to have super memory to remember her time on Krypton. She just had regular memory. Regular memory was sufficient for this. Because that used to be the thing in the 60s. Like, how does Superman know anything about Krypton?
Okay.
He has super
I
memory.
can think really hard.
Among his superpowers. You know, so when I was writing a lot of the Superman analog threads on Twitter, and I did a huge run on the various characters who have been named Supergirl, because, like, while Kara is the one that we know of now, there's been like 5 who have like a legitimate claim to being called Supergirl. And for all of them, but also every version of Kara specifically, sacrifice has been a big theme for the character. The original Supergirl that showed up, which was a creation made by a magic wand that Jimmy Olsen had, where he wished for a girl who could be like Superman, sacrificed herself to save Superman from kryptonite. Kara, infamously, in the 80s, died saving Superman from the Anti-Monitor. The various versions of Supergirl, of other Supergirls, have sacrificed themselves either to save timelines, like Sorel, or with Linda Danvers, the Matrix entity Supergirl / the Earth Angel Super. A lot of words to say to explain who that character is. Not going to go into all of them right now. We'll just suffice to say the 90s one sacrificed herself to save time and also her daughter. and then the version of Kara that we got ever since then has been given this familial responsibility as a protector for Superman, and one that she has unfortunately not even been able to live up to as much as she wants, but has always been set up to be like now. I should say has always, but since that revival in the early 2000s has been like, oh, it's the older cousin. She was forced to leave her home to protect her family and to protect the legacy of her people. And how much has she given up to be there? And that,
Right.
even goes back to Argo City in the first place, where she's the only survivor and other people could have been sent away. That at every point they're like, no, the best chance for what's important about us to survive is to make sure that you make it there. Like, there's enough fuel for one ship. I don't know if we have enough for two. Like, to get Kara off, like to get Kara to a place where she can thrive. And that is a part of Supergirl now. Like it is this much more mature standpoint. And like the character is optimistic, but it is in a different kind of way. It is recognizing the beauty even in the tragedy of her life. And I think that's kind of a cool element of Kara that the show really nailed.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure.
So let's move on to what is a spinoff of this show, which is Superman and Lois. So the theme that I dropped in is actually a mashup of the two Superman themes that they have. The one that is from Supergirl initially, which I believe has been used at times in the show, and then the one actually for the show itself, which is kind of short. So the initial part of it is by Blake Neely because it's part of the Supergirl run, and then it's Dan Romer who did the second half of it. And I like them both. I like them both a lot. The stuff coming from Supergirl I thought was fantastic. It sells this character so well. Like Tyler Hoechlin as Superman, I think he's great. He's my favorite Clark Kent, like full stop favorite Clark Kent. And I think he does a perfectly fine job as Superman. And the theme that they're using here, particularly the Romer stuff for the show, I find works really well to sell this older, more mature, like Hecklin's like a youngish guy, but he is a father in the show of two teenage boys. And like that element of like, he's already found himself. It's not the Man of Steel theme where he's at odds with himself trying to figure out who he is. At this point, no, he knows he's Superman. He knows all the stuff about that. He has found the woman he loves and he's raising people. And it is a different type of burden than who am I angst. It's how do I protect my children and the world?
Weirdly enough, this entire interpretation down to theme and orchestration has been my favorite interpretation of the character, period. Because it reveals a lot about the notion of what it means to be a man in the context of like having such a larger than life personality that is known by the rest of the world. And to the point where like season 2 kind of plays with that a little bit to some degree. They introduce Bizarro and Bizarro World, and in Bizarro World, Superman is actually hailed as like a rock star. He comes out says that he's Clark Kent, and like he just becomes Superman full time, and that's like his full time job, and he's a rock star. And they kind of tie it to like the bizarro-ness of himself, sort of just falls victim to like addiction and the struggles of living up to the idea of like what Superman should be. And I find that fascinating because it's just like it explores this idea of like, what if Clark Kent really embraced the mask of what Superman is and how many people perceive him to be that thing, when in reality he is very much just a human being. In the sense, like, they really take the time to say, like, I mean, like, he's the coach on his kids' football team in Smallville.
Yeah.
He becomes unemployed in the first episode of the show. He gets fired from the Daily Planet, and he essentially goes back to Smallville to sort of like refocus on like what his life should be. He faces like real struggles, just dealing with like general town politics and the way and like how trying to help his wife in her career as a journalist and having her work in small town journalism. All sorts of different facets of life and how sort of just how life sort of throws us challenges that I was missing from the character for so long. Like, I identified more with Clark Kent being the main thrust of who Superman is as opposed to Superman the idea. You know, and I think this orchestration by Dan Romer does a really great job at that, and just the way in which it sort of just weaves this sort of knowingness that it isn't necessarily like epic like Superman, but it is just like a Clark Kent who is so confident in who he is despite people thinking of him as the ideal of Superman. Like, I hear the theme play, and you like that. The one scene from the show that gets retweeted online so often is when like he goes up to that kid he saves, and he's like, "That's a cool costume. Thanks, my mom made it for me." And the theme is playing as that's happening. And when I saw that for the first time, I was just like, I got chills, and I was like, this is what I've been missing for like my entire life from this character that I never thought I would be able to get. Whereas just like he's just a guy trying his best. He's a guy with a mom. He's a guy with a dad. He's trying his best to make it through the world. He has a wife and kids at home. And he just has to deal with struggles of like, sure, being a rock star in the sense of like the Superman, the idea, but he's also he's just a dude. And this theme seems to encompass that a lot.
Yeah, admittedly, this is the only, of all of this stuff, this is the only thing I've not seen. I've seen Tyler Hoechlin as Superman in Supergirl, but I've not actually seen the Superman and Lois show. I've wanted to, and I haven't. Really but like this, I know. Look, I edited the episode where y'all talk about it, so I heard about it.
We all can't be Scott Thomas.
We can't all be Scott Thomas.
We can't absorb all of culture at once.
But like, I will say that like I loved his performance. I love this Lois. She is easily one of the best Loises we've ever seen on screen, and like this perfects what Lois and Clark tried to do. With that, this really shows the dynamic of a couple who loves each other, who is also trying to be superheroes. They both are, right? Lois Lane is a superhero in her own right.
Yeah.
And so like this show really plays to that from what I've heard about it. And so I do want to watch it at some point, but this theme, absolutely, both the Supergirl version that they used to introduce him and then even the Dan Romer version that's for this show make me want to watch the show in a way that I don't know the other themes would have, because I saw them with the property. I didn't hear them after, but this I'm hearing in isolation, especially the Dan Romer one. And I'm like, wow, this is really great. This does speak to all the things that Dan is talking about. And I think of the modern interpretations of Superman, I think it gets, that he's just a guy. I love Superman, but my biggest complaint that a lot of Superman naysayers had is he's unstoppable. It's boring. And yes, when he is like that, it is very true. Those stories about Superman are very boring. And it's part of the problem with Man of Steel is those moments where he's just an invulnerable brute. No one cares. That's not why people want to watch Superman. But this version of Superman has that vulnerability both in the theme and what I've seen of the character on Supergirl, and immediately makes it more interesting to me than any other version of this character.
Yeah. Like, I think the one thing I'll say in opposition to what you just said is that I think it is telling a different phase of the relationship than Lois and Clark. Like, Lois and Clark is the nascent love for them. And what is I think amazing about it is that from a storytelling perspective of Superman as dad, I think is so good. Like the fact of the matter is like, yeah, he is unstoppable, but he might be unstoppable, but he still can't be at two places at once. So if he misses therapy with one of his sons, or he misses his other son's football game, or all of those things, like those are the limitations of the character. Those are spots where he is just not able to do everything. He might be able to do anything, but he's just not able to do all the things he needs to all the time. And so that's where we get the stress. You know, he's not there for everyone because he fails at it. And some people have a mature relationship about it. Like, there's a scene in the first season where he misses out. Like, he was supposed to help out Lois on like a big town thing. And like, he can't be there because he has to be Superman somewhere. And she's really mad when he gets her. And she's like, no, I know you have an excuse. You're Superman. Like,
you literally do the most incredible thing any person could do.
Right. And she understands that. And, you know, but she's like, but I still need to be angry and I still need to hold on to this anger because I have to go yell at her son. And
it was one of the most psychologically mature things that I had ever seen on television, where it's just like, can I just be mad and let the thing be mad? And he's like, sure, I'm totally fine with that. Just I understand it. So just let it out. You know, there is such a level of care and maturity about the relationship between not only him and Lois, but him and his sons, to where it's like, I think he understands that so much of who he is now is defined by the totality of the people that he's surrounded himself with. And, you know, because, like, Batman's always had that angle of, like, the Bat family the kids that he indoctrinates into his crime fighting life. But this is like, it's genuinely like he is supported by Superman and Clark Kent are supported by his actual family, and Lois Lane is supported by her actual family, and each son feels like the weight of the responsibility of needing to be able to be a part of this thing, and also feeling like they are somewhat at odds with the system that is sort of that they've been born into. And I find that all the balance of all those things and the way everything has played out so far has just been really fascinating, and a beautiful examination of like family dynamics in the context of these larger than life characters.
I want to bring it back to the actual theme part of it, and I think here's the way. There's a vibe going on in the theme that feels kind of like a Little House on the Prairie type thing.
Yeah.
And that goes for... So they move back to Smallville, and Clark is so happy to be back at Smallville. And there's this element of just like looking at all the places he grew up in and like smiling, like that nostalgia for a place that was so important to who you were, not necessarily who you are now, but it meant so much to you, and like trying to stay connected to that all. Like there's this big theme of him like reconnecting with his friends from high school, and like showing the boys the town that he grew up in and loved, but they grew up in Metropolis. Like they're used to they're city boys, like, and it's like a weird juxtaposition for them. And the theme, I think, does a really good job of, it feels like the Superman score looking over the cornfield. Mm-hmm. Like it's a theme that would work really well also for like Superman for All Seasons, but this is that mature, like he's pop now. Like that's his role now.
That's a good way to interpret it. Yeah.
And I think the theme does a really good job of selling that. And I don't have the musical lexicon to really explain what I'm talking about here, but like, I think if you hear it and you think like, can you look at the moon while like from a cornfield and like while listening to this, you're like, yeah, no, that feels like the right epic.
It's, you want the moon, Mary? I can tie a lasso around it and pull it down to you, kind of thing, where it's like folksy, kind of like, it is almost a mature interpretation to showcase like who Superman could be if he grew beyond the ideal of what everybody in the world has sort of set him up to be.
Yeah, so that's I think we said our piece on this one. I think it's a great theme, and that's the last one we had to talk about on this list. So we want to come back next time and talk more about songs, but instead of being the ways of expressing Superman in music, it's music that is influenced by Superman as a pop culture figure. So we'll be back next time for that conversation with Matt, but Dan, you're not coming back for that one. So Dan, this is your first time on the show. You've become a legend in the pop culture podcasting field, the friend of all pods.
Oh boy!
But give your plugs to anything you want to mention while you're here. Like, I'm just glad that you're on the show finally.
I'm glad to be on the show. Weirdly enough, Superman has become a character as I've gotten older, as somebody that I can identify and aspire to be towards a lot more, especially with regards to, again, as I've mentioned just recently, the Superman and Lois. It feels like that's the person that I'm like trying to aim for in terms of like I want to like live my life like that, and to some degree. But as you could also probably tell, music is very much a big facet of my life, and in addition to having been on a bunch of podcasts amongst the sort of community of podcasters related to pop culture, pop comics, all that kind of stuff, I am a singer-songwriter, a composer, and producer for different things. I've done the stingers for the Infinity podcast. I did the This Is Not a News sort of series of stingers. I recently just did one for the podcast that I currently work on and sort of am the producer for. They wanted a relationship corner. It's a podcast about mental health, and they wanted like a specific like little stinger about a relationship corner. I did the Comics Quest theme for J.D. Martin. I've done a lot of music in that regard, and in addition to that, I sort of have my own artist project as me, Dan Purcell. Last year, I released an EP of seven songs, and this coming summer, I'm going to be starting to roll out what is going to be my debut album. Starting in the month of June, I'm not sure when this is going to air, but starting in the month of June, you can check out all of the first couple of singles that are going to be dropping from that album. With fingers crossed, hopefully the full album will be released along with a music video that I'm actually working on with Seth from the Film Rescue podcast sometime in August. But if you would like to find out when the definitive dates for those things were going to happen, you can follow me on all social media platforms at the Dan Purcell. That's at the Dan Purcell. And you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, the whole 9 yards, YouTube if you like, the whole 9 yards. You'll find out when I'm going to be posting stuff, and you can stream me on your favorite streaming platform of choice, be it Spotify, Apple Music, Tidal, SoundCloud, Deezer. Who uses Deezer? I have no idea, but I like to incorporate them because apparently people find Deezer important.
Dan, he's big on Deezer.
Yes, I'm big on Deezer. And yeah, I'm really glad that we finally got the opportunity to connect and really get and have an opportunity to talk about two things that I really love, which Superman and music.
Yeah, this was a really fun chat. I was really glad you could be here. Everyone should check out your album, which will have dropped by the time this episode comes out. Yeah, we're recording this in May, but this is definitely not coming out until I think August.
Check out Grow Better.
We'll see where we're at when it actually drops.
You stream things.
Definitely not June. Matt, thank you for coming on. Listeners may know that you are the editor for this show, but you've got a lot of stuff, so plugs.
Sure. I'm not going to plug it all. I mean, if you like the opening bits and the post-credit bits to the shows, I pick out like 90% of them, so you can thank me for that. You know, when Case isn't screwing up some part of the intro, outro, I find some other good gems within the show. I'm happy to be here, of course. I loved coming on and talking about Superman the Animated Series. It's great to actually be on an episode with J. Mike, the one might argue better, definitely more handsome half of the podcast.
All of this is true, yeah.
But yeah, I do a ton of different shit. I edit a bunch of shows on the network. I, of course, host 4 shows on Certain POV. All of them can be found at certainpov.com. If you want to check out all the things I do both on and off the network, you can go to djstormageddon.com. I am DJ_Stormageddon literally on every social media platform and on Twitch. And yeah, I'm not going to plug each individual show because that'll be a huge pain in the ass and waste of everyone's time. So instead, again, DJ_Stormageddon on Twitter, where I'm most active, or djstormageddon.com.
J. Mike, where can people find you?
You always do this. I just follow everyone up with all their fancy stuff. I'm like, I'm not that popular. You can find me on Twitter at jmike101. I crack jokes with Case and Matt sometimes. I have a mean gift game.
It's true.
It's bad you.
Mm-hmm. You do. Best in the business.
Exactly.
As for me, you can find me at Case Aiken. You can find the show on Twitter at Men of Steel Pod. I do other stuff. You can find the videos we're working on the Certain POV YouTube channel. So I've got the Superman analog videos, and we've got the side quest videos that I edit. But Matt is the one who actually corrals that whole baby. So he gets me the audio. I make the videos, baby.
Yeah.
You can find those on the Certain POV YouTube channel. So look up Certain POV Media. And then we've got another pass, and I'll probably insert the audio of what the next episode is because I'm trying to actually be good about that shit. But that'll be post. So Matt, don't worry. And here I am as Case from the future to tell you that another pass, we just did an episode on Murder on the Orient Express. Over on the Superman Analogs YouTube series, we just did a roundup of the various Miss Marvels, and we're now animating clips from all of our shows. So check those out at the Certain POV YouTube channel. Back to the past.
Okay, great.
But yeah, you should check out everything our wonderful guests are working on. You should check out J. Mike's gift game. You should check out the stuff that I'm putting out there. But until next time, stay super, man.
Men of Steel is a Certain POV production. Our hosts are J. Mike Folsom and Case Aiken. The show is edited by Matt Storm. Our logo is by Chris Batista. Episode art is by Case Aiken. And our theme is by Geoff Moonen.
All right, so it's going to be 1, 2, 3, and then clap, all right? 1, 2, 3.
Look at that. All audio people in sync. And I'm assuming J. Mike was because I can't see him.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon, and I'm the host of CPOV Autographs at certainpov.com. It is a bi-weekly interview series where I interview folks from all over the arts, from writers to comedians to magicians to musicians, even actors, historians, podcasters, pretty much anyone who's willing to chat with me for a little bit. If you like interesting conversations with even more interesting people, go to certainpov.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, music is life, and life is good.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.